I'm getting everything set up to record. Um, and I'm going to just start out by noting we're in the middle of a extended discussion of a particular theme, and I'm going to continue that theme. But there are other things happening in the world, and so I think we should take note for a moment that yesterday the United States attacked various locations in Syria and Iraq affiliated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in retaliation for the killing of three American service people in Jordan a week ago, and that at the same time, Israel is continuing to press further south with its invasion of Gaza, and the humanitarian nightmare for the Palestinians continues to mount there. And increasingly, Israel civil society is divided about the conduct of the war, the time frame of the war. But having noted all that, I want to really pay attention to the fact that for a moment, this is an escalating regional war. And that's, I think, an objective description. It's not yet a full-blown regional war. The conflict is primarily between Israel and Hamas, but there is increasing involvement, in particular, of Iranian backed militias that are attempting to disrupt trade in the region by targeting ships and targeting, in particular, American and Israeli personnel in the region. And the US is finding itself drawn into the need to respond. And this is something we should just be noticing. I think that the correct description of the situation is that neither the United States nor Iran wants a broader regional war. And yet we know from history that very often countries that don't want to be drawn into broader wars are drawn into broader wars because of the logic of escalation, because of the need to respond to the other side, because of the need to secure your domestic support via responding appropriately when attacked internationally. And the fact that these hostilities occur in a moment of vulnerability for both the leadership of Iran and the leadership of the United States occur as we approach a general election. I have, generally speaking, fairly good faith in the maturity of the decision makers in the American government right now and in Biden's cabinet. But there is no doubt that Joe Biden does not want to be seen as weak in the Middle East as he enters a general election campaign. Similarly, in Iran, the fact that they are in a period of concerted protests in which young people especially are showing great courage and sacrifice in protesting against the Islamic regime creates certain dynamics internally. And so I just think this is something we should have an eye on, that we should be concerned about as we witness the slow and hopefully ultimately contained escalation of hostilities in the Middle East. One of the dangers, and I think we have to be as clear as possible, there are dangers to Israel from allowing Hamas to maintain its capability on its doorstep. It's not clear to me, frankly, that Israel can really prevent Hamas from regaining that capability or that it can bear the cost of doing so. But there are also dangers to Israel internationally in terms of its reputation, in the way in which it's conducting the war, and in terms of the level of support that it receives from the allies on which it relies, if those allies are increasingly critical of its conduct in this war. And then there are the dangers to uh, the Jewish diaspora outside of Israel if Israel's conduct generates greater anti-Semitism worldwide. And finally, there are dangers in terms of regional warfare. And that as we look at that issue, the conflict in Israel and Gaza right now, we need to be paying attention to those concentric rings of danger. The other thing I'm just going to note briefly before we get into the main topic for today is that we learned late last week or a couple days ago that the federal judge in the January 6th invasion of the Capitol trial, the felony trial for Donald Trump, related to efforts to overturn the election of 2020, has been indefinitely delayed. And in talking with you almost a month ago now about the things that we can expect in 2024 in the national election, I suggested that perhaps the best hope for establishing some level of national agreement about the extent of the culpability of the former president for the January 6th incursion and other efforts to overturn the election would be for a trial by a jury of his peers to have successfully concluded prior to the election. It does appear, given the way in which Fox News and the right wing media ecosystem work to disseminate, amplify, and lend credibility to a narrative that exculpates the former president of all blame and shifts blame onto other actors, given the fact that the Republican Party has at this point clearly prioritized electoral victory over fidelity to the Constitution and views its path to electoral victory moving very narrowly through its devotion to the single candidate, Donald Trump, that the likelihood of us having any level of agreement that in some way passes over the degree of partisan polarization we experience right now really hinges on the outcome of trials that may be viewed by some Americans as independent arbiters of what actually occurred. And I may be investing too much hope in the capacity of the jury system and the court system to deliver us from the epistemic anarchy that is characteristic of American politics in the first decades of the 21st century. But it seems to me it's our last best hope. And the fact that the appellate court has not yet decided on the question of absolute presidential immunity for anything done while in office, is now delaying that trial. And I think it's worthwhile noting the language with which the judge announced the delay. She said, when or if the appellate court determines whether or not there is absolute presidential immunity. And I don't think she meant to imply that this court will never reach a decision. But I think she is calling our attention to the fact that should Donald Trump win re-election, right? I don't want to suggest that that's inevitable by any stretch of the imagination. I still think it's somewhat improbable. But having said that, if he is the candidate of his party, then he has a considerable likelihood of becoming the next president of the United States. And then he will be able to direct the Justice Department to stop pursuing these cases. And then, right, there may never be that trial that will establish, if anything can, some greater level of agreement about what happened factually. So that's another thing that happened this last week that I'm not going to talk about at length today, but that it seems to me is important enough to just note briefly at the outset. What I am going to do today, and please remember, as always, if you want to comment on or ask a question about or disagree with, express a view on either of those two topics, feel free to do so now. Just raise your hand, unmute yourself, put something in the chat. Unless you do that, I'm going to jump into the subject matter for today. And this is a continuation of the discussion that we've been having for several weeks now on important economic trends and their political implications that seem to be unique to the 21st century. And in particular, this idea that I'm borrowing from Branko Milanovic, the curse of wealth, the idea that on the one hand, after we reach a certain level of affluence that the United States reached quite a while ago, it appears that increased wealth, either societally or even individually, does not secure greater well being or health, greater connection to our immediate family or friends or greater community for our society as a whole. And then the more precise sense in which Milanovic means this phrase that the wealthier we get as a society, the more unequal we become as a society, and that there are deleterious consequences to that inequality for our politics, but also for our overall social health as a society, for our capacity to trust each other, to maintain faith in progress, to make sacrifices for the future, to sustain a sense of community, but also for our children to learn, for our propensity to drug or alcohol addiction and other self destructive behaviors. All of this seems to be exacerbated by higher levels of inequality. If the only way in which we can get wealthier is by increasing our inequality, at some point we need to be asking, is it worth it? So I've put on the uh, board a new, well, not entirely new painting. Obviously, it's from the 1860s, and we've looked at it together before in the past few uh, sessions. I've used an image from Goya, The Gift, which seems to me to indicate the psychology of superiority and deference in a very succinct way. This is a slightly different image. This is called The Old Musician, and it is an image of people who have been expelled from Paris in the middle of the 19th century as Paris modernizes. And in particular, these are people who had been long-term residents of Paris, but who now find themselves homeless and in a field because in order to build the grand boulevards and avenues, their homes had to be demolished, and the French made no effort to rehouse in their neighborhoods the people who had been displaced. And the old musician from whom the painting takes its title has in particular this direct gaze at the reader, I'm sorry, the viewer, and it's a j'accuse, an accusatory stare. At least that's the way in which it's typically interpreted. And so I choose this image in part because it seems to me what we've been looking at over the last few weeks maybe comes down to not only the hard material impact of an economy, how much productivity does it contain? How much wealth does it generate? How much growth? How many jobs? And how are they distributed, right? And please note, we got new jobs data last week, and it was very robust jobs data. This economy is booming. And yet, in continuing to do the research for these lectures, one of the things I find is that it's been almost 25 years now since a majority of Americans felt that the country was moving in the right direction. So for the entirety of the 21st century, the majority of Americans feel that the country was moving in the wrong direction. And that is an astounding verdict on our society. And I think a lot of it has to do with our economy and not with its capacity for productivity or job creation or wealth creation. I think in most respects, the last quarter century have been very productive. And if we look at the macro metrics of economic productivity, job creation, wealth creation, I think it's much more about the expressive dimension of our economy. Does our economy treat all members with equal concern and respect? Does it, in particular, affirm their dignity? Or are a certain number of our workers treated as if they are simply dispensable, no longer integral to our society, and the way in which we compensate them, the relative distribution of our wealth, the way in which they are treated in work reveals and reflects, expresses that lack of equal concern, that lack of respect for a substantial portion of our population. So I've got some old data and some new data on the board here, right? The fact that we moved from a period of great inequality to a period of much less inequality back to a period of great inequality not only indicates, if you will, the long-term arc of inequality in the United States over the last 120 odd years, but also, I think, from the perspective of many people whose lives and prospects improved and whose expectations were set accordingly, only to have them violated in the subsequent return to inequality, a failure of policy, a failure of politics, a failure of concern for the well-being of substantial portions of our population. And this is reflected in then the rise, the consistent rise over the 21st century of so-called deaths of despair from suicide, from alcohol and drug-related overdoses and deaths. And please note, right, and it's astounding to see, right, how badly the United States lags in life expectancy relative to the 20 richest countries on earth. We are at this point in, excuse the phrase, dead last, and by half a decade relative to the average for the most developed countries in the world. This is in part to do, no doubt, with the failures of our healthcare system. It's in part to do with racial inequalities in access to healthcare, but it is also driven by the rapid increase in deaths of despair, the deep mistrust of government and health officials, so that in the pandemic, we were more mistrustful of what our government and our doctors told us to do, less willing to take vaccines, less willing to mask. And all of this, it seems to me, is a reflection of the fact that a substantial portion of our society feels that the society as a whole, and in particular people in elite and powerful positions, are indifferent to their well-being, not to be trusted, not to be respected, not to have their expertise valued, because there's a lack of reciprocal value and concern. Now, very quickly. We looked in particular at how best to explain the rising inequality. And I guess I'm going to suggest, to simplify things, a twofold explanation. The first is what uh, Branko Milanovic, building on the work of Thomas Piketty and others, calls the curse of wealth. I'm sorry, and the suggestion is quite simply that there are some pretty deep and important economic trends. You might call them laws, though unlike perhaps laws of the physical universe, they can be modified through policy. But deep-seated tendencies to generate inequality as wealth grows. And so the fact that the rate of return on capital tends to be higher than the overall rate of economic growth means if economic growth continues to accelerate, so too will the rate of return on capital. It will always exceed, or at least over the long term. And that for that to be the case, it is also the case that the rate of return on capital typically is higher than wage growth. And at the same time, that all of that, and so here's the second variable, is influenced by policy. And having perhaps become overly concerned with the situation of the middle and the least well off in the middle of the 20th century, having pursued policies that brought the return on capital so low that the capitalist class decided to invest elsewhere or sit on its capital, a so-called capital strike. We overcorrected dramatically in the last 20 years of the 20th century and the first 20 years of the 21st century, allowing inequality to roar back. So the fact that we're continuing to get wealthier is driving greater inequality. The fact that we have dismantled the policies that might counteract that means that that inequality is now unregulated and that our society is suffering the consequences of the return to the new Gilded Age. We looked in particular last week at some of the features of 21st century capital, which differentiated from 20th century capitalism. That the share of capital income is rising again. That's shown in these diagrams. That capital income rich are also labor rich, which is to say the people who are making a lot from investing are also drawing the highest salaries in our society. The fact that the rich marry each other, homogamy, right? And so there's a um, combination of rich families with high endowments accompanying the start of life, as opposed to people who are better off marrying people who are middle class or working class, and then some uplift occurring as a result of a family with a rich endowment being merged with at least one of the offspring of a family who doesn't have that endowment. And then the idea that in the middle of the 20th century, especially through investment in public education, we made real efforts to create greater opportunity for the children of people who were middle class or working class or lower class to move up the economic ladder through better education, through more inclusive hiring, and that by the time we get to the 21st century, that is no longer the case. And so the consequence is we see this in the United States, the United Kingdom, in Germany, even in Norway, that we are becoming more unequal across the board as our societies get richer. And I think we just need to pause for a moment as we approach a national election and ask ourselves, is the sign of successful governmental economic policy simply that as a society we get wealthier? Or is there not a predictable consequence to that increased wealth in terms of increased inequality that is debilitating? Have we not become rich enough that perhaps we should be paying more attention to the sufficiency of the resources that we control and not their ever increasing expansion? Should we not be paying more attention to the human consequences of the way in which we organize our economy as opposed to simply its capacity for wealth generation? I suggested to you, right, that the rate of growth of income, right, for the society as a whole has decreased steadily, that inequality has increased steadily, and in particular, that the share of the wealth being generated in our society that goes to labor has decreased and has decreased steadily over the last 80 years. And again, these are macroeconomic trends that are strongly correlated with wealth creation. If we recognize that wealth generates inequality, that the increase in societal wealth has this necessary consequence, what should our priority be as a society? I've suggested to you that the result of not taking this into account is that we have ever increasing inequality as a society. Sorry, forgot my timepiece. And that, right, we have gone from being a society in which we were essentially comparable to each other, even across our wealth divide, into being a society in which we really inhabit separate and distinct social worlds, given the extensive differences in income and wealth characteristic of a highly unequal society. I've suggested to you that there's nothing fair about this inequality. There would be one thing if our earnings had stagnated because our economy was stagnating, but the old social compact, the idea that if the economy grows, then everybody should be lifted by the growing economy, came apart in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and has never been restored. To the extent that household income has increased, it's because people are working longer hours, because women have entered the labor force, because people are working more jobs, two or three. The idea of a side hustle has become essential to the economic prospects of so many people who are coming of age in America in the 21st century. And please note that the work that people are doing to keep their house afloat, doing more and more of, right? Americans work 20 hours a week more on average than Germans, who are the hardest working people in Europe. The work that we're doing, many of us experience at best as stultifying, and at worst as dangerous and degrading. And so in order to stay afloat in a rich society, large portions of our population are forced to do work that is not rewarding, quite the opposite. One of the books that I'll speak with you a little bit more about today, and that I've been reading to get the research in uh, to share with you for these lectures, is a new book by the Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times economic correspondent David Leonhardt. And his book is called Ours Was the Shining Future. It's published within the last few months. This is a diagram from that book that I think, in a sense, does a really good job at synthesizing a lot of the data I shared with you last week. So it's a new diagram that shows, I think, uh, in a concise way, some of the stuff about the increasing skew in the distribution of the benefits of economic growth in the United States, comparing the middle of the 20th century to the neoliberal period from 1980 to the present. And so, as you can see, in the period from the end of World War II to 1980, the economy grew substantially, and the benefits of that economic growth went primarily to the bottom 10%, and then to the bottom 25%. And then those in the middle class, the 50th percentile, did reasonably well. Yes, those in the 90th percentile and those in the top 1% did quite well as well, even those in the top 0.01%. But clearly, our economy most benefited those at the bottom. And one of the reasons to want the benefits of growth to go to the least well off is that unless that happens, right, and this is uh, increases, percentage increase in uh, income year over year, unless the bottom 10% are doing better than those at the top, the inequalities in our society are going to widen as opposed to staying the same or narrowing. This is the effect of compounding, right? Because those at the top already have greater incomes. If their incomes increase by the same amount as those at the bottom, the chasm between them will increase further. We then compare this to the more recent period, the last 40 years. And as you can see, negligible increases at the bottom, barely anything to speak of, but look at the top 0.001%, the top 0.1%, the dark lines, right, are the more recent time period. And again, there's a uniformity to this. The lower down the economic scale you are, the less economic growth is benefiting you. And then that's what accounts for this pattern, right? This is not just a pattern of inequality. This is a pattern of accelerating inequality. With each passing year, inequality becomes more extreme. That's because of the way in which increases in income compound inequality when they are highly unequal. So we started talking about last week the additional impacts of the kind of economy we have. And I want to begin here elaborating some of these ideas. And so I'm going to start with decreases in mobility and equality of opportunity. And you may have noticed, right, in Milanovich's diagram, which I shared with you a few minutes ago. Sorry, my slides are not cooperating with me. The idea that he suggests that in the middle of the 20th century, there was some cases of parental transmission of advantage being weakened. Weakened because of the availability of public education, weakened because of the institution of inheritance taxation, decreasing the amount that could be passed from generation to generation. And so some greater equality of opportunity. And this is really where Leonhardt's work focuses. The quote, ours was the shining future, is actually from his grandmother in no, I take it back. It's from a book written in the 1930s. Actually, it's a quotation from the book from which the phrase the American dream is derived. And he uses it to characterize his grandparents' prospects in the 1940s, as they started their family in the 1940s. Um, and the idea that anyone in the United States. And here again, we always need to qualify. We need to talk about race. We need to talk about gender. We need to talk about class. But having said that, that most people in the United States, including African Americans, could be reasonably confident that their children were going to do better than them, and that there was a reasonable chance that their children were not just going to be overall better off than them, but that they could actually rise to a higher income category relative to other people. That was an idea that um, gave rise to a sense of confidence, a sense of inclusion, a sense of fairness, a sense of democratic mutual respect, ultimately a sense of progress in the United States. And so ours is a shining future is an indication of that confidence in progress if one works hard. What we see in the current United States, right, is quite the opposite. If you're born in the bottom 20%, there's a 43% chance you're going to remain there, less than a 5% chance that you're going to move up to the top 20%. If you're born in the top 20%, 40% chance that you're going to stay there, less than 10% chance that you're going to tumble down to the bottom. And if people don't tumble down, there's no room for people to move up, right? So we have become a less mobile society than almost any society in the developed world, right? We are up here in terms of the inelasticity of intergenerational earnings. Your parents' earnings predict your earnings in the United States in a way that puts us in the category of the least mobile developed societies. And by the way, as this diagram shows, the more equal a society, generally speaking, the more mobile the society. The more unequal society, the less mobile the society. And we know the mechanisms that are at work. There are two big mechanisms. One of them is just as the society is more unequal, there's more space between the rungs on the ladder. It's harder for people to climb up. But secondly, and I think much more important, in a more unequal society, it's much more important, if you can, to transmit your advantage to your children, because tumbling down is tumbling far down. And so in a more unequal society, those who have wealth and privilege spend more of their wealth and invest more of their privilege in transmitting wealth and privilege to their children. And so another way to put this is we become a more competitive society because we're a more unequal society. And that tends to limit the capacity for mobility. Um, I now want to talk about the broader implications of living in a society in which there isn't opportunity for upward mobility to the degree to which many people expect there should be. A society in which there certainly isn't any idea of equal or fair opportunity for economic mobility. And one way to put this is to look at what Robert Putnam in the upswing work we've talked about together before calls the interbraided causality of the growth in equality, opportunity, but also community in the 20th century in the United States, right? We moved from a society with great economic inequality, political competition and polarization, individuality at the level of society, or individualism, atomization, competition at the level of society, and lack of solidarity at the level of culture. And all of these things move up together. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this new work by David Leonhardt is the way in which he suggests, well, when you have the prospect for moving up economically, it has broader cultural implications. You can feel that your society as a whole is a progressive society. Things keep getting better for most people over time. And that allows you to have a kind of security in your status, in your belonging, in the cooperative nature of your society that allows you to be generous to your fellow citizens. It also allows people to say, if I invest today in my future, or if we collectively invest together in our future, this will be rewarding for each and all of us. And so it allows us to engage in cooperation and long term economic planning. And finally, it gives us confidence in our institutions. It gives us confidence that our leaders work for us, especially our elected leaders, but perhaps also confidence in our other institutions, like our educational institution. It's not merely a method for transmitting and whitewashing the transmission of privilege from one generation to the next. I think it's important to notice that that's the way many people think about higher education in the United States today. This is a island of privilege, a bubble that allows for the transmission of privilege generation to generation. It's part of the reason there's so much ire directed against Harvard and Penn and MIT over their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Diversity, equity, and inclusion for whom? When 80% of the people who attend those schools come from the top 20% of society, we're really only talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion for the very wealthy. And that leads us to withdraw respect for the experts who those institutions generate. That makes us not only a more fractious society, but a society less able to build on the collective knowledge that our knowledge generating institutions provide. So that's the first, right, major aspect of the kind of economy we have in the 21st century and what it's doing to us. A second major aspect, I think, again, this is extremely important to recognize, which is that our economy has become a genuinely global economy. Our corporations are now multinational corporations. What we purchase is assembled from components that are supplied all over the world. And among the consequences of inhabiting an economy where capital and supply chains and increasingly labor are highly mobile is that the nation state, the level at which we organize our government and our democracy is weaker in terms of its capacity to control the economic forces that influence the lives of most individuals in the society. And so again, do we as a society feel in the middle of the 21st century that it is worthwhile trading the capacity to control our own economic fate for greater wealth? We have implicitly made that bargain should we be reconsidering that bargain, given the level of affluence we have, and given the way in which the erosion of poverty reducing policy has rendered such a large portion of our population vulnerable? I'm going to start speaking about the poor in particular in greater detail as we get further into this topic. I think next thing to notice is, assuming we did return to the objective of countering inequality, and in particular reducing the precariousness and vulnerability of the least well off through public policy, could we simply return to the public policy that worked reasonably well to do this for those it targeted, primarily white working class people, in the middle of the 20th century? Or have the forces generating inequality and vulnerability changed such that our policy would need to change? And I'm inclined to think it is the second. And therefore, right, part of what we noticed last week, and I'll just go back to the diagram briefly to refresh your memory from Piketty's research, sorry, is this idea that we did better at in terms of creating a middle class with regards to the distribution of wealth than we did in equalizing income, comparing the top 10% with the bottom 50%. That part of the reason we stabilized the middle class is because once you have a sufficient share of wealth to not only be able to secure your own economic viability over the course of your life, but actually to provide resources for the next generation, to assist, for instance, your children in purchasing a home, or financing their education, or financing their initial forays into business or work or creativity, that you can then assist them in maintaining a middle class existence. I would suggest to you that as we enter the the middle of the 21st century, we need also to be thinking about policies that work the way, for instance, mortgage assistance worked in the middle of the 20th century, not just to redistribute income, in other words, but to what's sometimes called pre-distribute access to wealth. Our economic inequality, our 21st century economy, seems to be undermining democracy as well. And I will be very brief. I think this is fairly obvious, but when our campaigns are billion-dollar affairs, when the majority of the funding for those campaigns comes from super PACs that are, generally speaking, unregulated and funded by a very small portion of the population, when upwards of 40% of the money that goes into funding these very expensive elections comes from the 0.01% wealthiest of our society, as is the case in the United States today, it is almost automatic that the wealthiest are going to have much greater influence over the kinds of policies that those who win elections are willing to write and pass, right? And so the sense that we really have become an oligarchy, and that we maybe should withdraw faith from the capacity of our old democracy to fix our 21st century problems, is another of the impacts of the kind of economy we have. The erosion of ethical capitalism and a new ethics of ruthless competition and conspicuous consumption. It's not about what's good for us. It's not about being modest and decent in one's economic decision making. That, in a sense, being ruthlessly competitive and greedy is what produces the general good, the maximal wealth, not just for you, but for your society. This excessive confidence in the invisible hand and this tremendous commitment to market justice. If I have it, it's because I deserve it, because I'm worth more, and therefore there's no restriction on me displaying my wealth. And I use Trump as an example of this, not only because when he's accused of not paying his taxes or not paying his employees, he simply says, well, that's because I'm a smart businessman. That's what smart business people do. There's no shame. There's no sense that we should have ethical restrictions on our behavior in the economy. One of the people I'm reading calls the economy increasingly a norm free zone. You just maximize your own interest and to hell with everyone else. That seems to be increasingly the ethos, the spirit of 21st century capitalism. And then because we deserve whatever we get, because whatever we got reflects our marginal contribution to the productivity of the economy, why should we feel at all sheepish, have any qualms about displaying my $350,000 Lamborghini or Trump's big gold throne that he sits in on The Apprentice? We now live in a world where the robber barons of old might blush over the degree to which we display the gains of our wealth creation. The commodification of everything and atomization are two broader cultural implications. The fact that we sell our home, our intimate space, on platforms like um, Airbnb, the fact that we sell our spare time on platforms like Uber and Lyft, the fact that we are increasingly less inclined to form families, less inclined to form lasting social networks because more and more of what we need can be bought because everything has been commodified. All of this seems to point to the idea that the degree of marketization characteristic of a 21st century economy is undermining much that we value, and that we, again, should be carefully thinking about this. So I now want to transition, and I'll be brief in providing an overview of this. Um, of not just inequality, but poverty in the United States. And so I start with this diagram, a kind of pie chart of the distribution of income, and note how many people have been left out of income creation, of wealth creation in our society. So 46% of Americans make $30,000 a year or less. And please note, right within that group, there's 12% who make less than 5,000, another almost 8% who make less than 10,000, right? Another 7% roughly who make less than $15,000 per year. And this indicates then that there's a large swath of our population who's become very vulnerable in order for a much smaller portion of our population to become very rich. It is as if, in one of the calculations that's done in one of the books on this, everyone in our society had transferred $110,000 over the last 15 years from their own income and wealth to the wealth of the top 10%. And I'm just going to quote very briefly from Matthew Desmond's important new work on Poverty by America. Um, the way in which poverty is not just a inadequate share of income. It is all of the vulnerabilities that come with the inadequate share of income, the expressive harm, the psychological pain that comes with precariousness, but also a recognition that your society seems not to care about you, seems not to respect you. So in this book, Poverty by America, by the sociologist Matthew Desmond at Princeton University, won a Pulitzer Prize. We got two Pulitzer Prize winners on the reading list today, David Leonhardt and Matthew Desmond for his earlier book, Evicted. This is the way Matthew Desmond kind of summarizes this list that I'm going to go through with you in more detail next week. Poverty is often material scarcity piled on chronic pain, piled on incarceration, piled on depression, piled on addiction. On it goes. Poverty isn't a line, it's a tight knot of social maladies. It is connected to I'm sorry, that should be to every social problem we care about: crime, education, housing. And its persistence in American life means that millions of families are denied safety and security and dignity in one of the richest nations in the history of the world. So, again, is it worthwhile to have the level of collective wealth that we have as a society if the cost of having that level of wealth is that a large portion of our population experiences constant vulnerability and degradation? And the suggestion that Desmond makes in that book, to be as clear as possible, is that the reason, or at least part of the reason, we have so many poor people in America is because so many better off people profit from industries that prey on poverty. I'll stop there. I imagine you must have thoughts and comments. Let me open it up. Who wants to start us out today? Yeah, Iris, go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself. Iris, I think you're still muted.
How about that?
There you go. Perfect.
Okay. I wanted to point out just two quick things that occur to me. One is that our tough on crime was promoted throughout the United States as the only way to deal with criminality, identified very broadly. And it destroyed our Black communities. Single mothers earning minimum wage with children could not possibly ensure the educational and health needs of their children. And the second thing is the destruction of the labor unions under Ronald Reagan. It was horrendously effective. And I wanted to ask you, my concern is with social media and public public stations being controlled by the very wealthy corporations, is there any chance that people are going to get educated as to the facts underlying their poor choices in gaining equality?
So let me, in a sense, tie all of that together for a second, Iris. They're great questions. They're hard questions, but you let's start with the general observation that there was an increase in crime, and especially violent crime, that accompanied the COVID pandemic and people not having access to work, to school, and hence finding more time on their hands, more capacity to perhaps be influenced by people to commit crime. It appears that there's a certain truth to that generalization. Then we note that since the end of the pandemic, violent crime has gone down substantially all across the United States. Um, and yet, most Americans believe that violent crime is much higher than it is. Right, and in particular, the people who study this suggest that the American overestimation of the propensity for violent crime in their neighborhood is 8 times as high. If you ask them how many people are robbed, how many people are burglarized, how many people are murdered, if you got to put a number on it or as a proportion, what's your risk of this happening to you in any given year, Americans overestimate violent crime by 8 times its actual incidence. And then we compare that with other societies, and that's actually anomalous. It's strange, but for whatever reason, we'll go into that in just a second. Most other societies have a much more accurate perception of violent crime than we do. So then we get to the second aspect of this, which is that the United States has much more local broadcast news than many other societies, and it is commercial, right, in the sense that it's for-profit news broadcasting. And it turns out if it bleeds, it leads, right? That one of the things that the stations have learned is that people tune in at 6 p.m. because they want to hear about the violent crime or something else similarly spectacular. But violent crime is one of the things that get people to keep their eyes on the station, which gets them their advertising revenue, which makes them profitable, right? And so it's not a simple distortion in perception. It is that our information system, our media system, distorts our perception of reality, right? And then we add racism to this, and again, much greater coverage of Black crime, and especially Black on white crime, than there is of other incidents of crimes. And again, because there's a commercial incentive to do this, and we end up with these tough on crime uh, policy approaches, which not only resulted in these strong disproportions in our criminal justice system. Many more African Americans jailed than white Americans. I don't have the actual figures on the top of my head, but it's highly skewed. And you add to that, right, that the incidence of crime is essentially similar for Blacks and whites, but the likelihood of being apprehended, charged, convicted is much higher with African Americans. And so we put all of that together. And yes, this gutted African American, in particular, urban communities, which were subject to intensive policing and incredibly destructive intergenerationally. There's interesting literature on what it does, in particular to boys, to have no male role model within their family. I'm throwing a lot at you at the same time, but part of what I'm trying to get at is that yes, we often are inaccurate in our self-understanding of what's going on in our social world. Will we become rational about the way in which economic growth in the 21st century is contributing to our inequality, to our isolation, to our underlying social problems? And part of the reason I'm talking with you about this, right, if you remember the whole premise of this discussion, is because I'm worried that that's not happening in our society, that we're entering a national election in which there is not going to be a sustained critical conversation about why our economy is not producing greater security, greater equality, greater well-being, but the opposite. And so yes, I do deeply share your concern that we are on this treadmill in which we just think what we need is more income, what we need is more wealth. And if we can only get 10% more, we will be finally secure. Please note that Americans have been saying that generation after generation after generation. And it is the case that we are, you know, 30% wealthier than we were 60 years ago, and yet it's not translating into well-being, into happiness, into health, into security, into equality. Maybe we need to try a different approach. Yeah, thank you for the good question, Iris. Obviously, it got me going. And anybody else with a question, thought, comment at this juncture? Trying to see. Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about basic education level in this. That we did watch the movie Blind Spotting last night. And one of the things that came across to me is that the vocabulary of these people is very limited. I don't mean that it's not mine, but it's very limited. And they were much more able to express their thoughts, their emotions physically than they are verbally. And we have been saying things like college for all and whatever. I would like us to get back to 8th grade for all. And perhaps sounds very radical. Perhaps if we made our education be one of privilege, not required, we might find that people who were in these lower abilities sought this, because it is true that whether we're looking for increased wealth for the wealthy or increased wealth, the economy needs to have people that are literate.
Yeah.
You cannot enter the real workforce if you are not literate. So that's my comment, my question.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Hannah. And so I haven't seen Blind Spotting, and so I'm not going to comment on the film that is
No,
the jumping off
I'm
point,
not either.
but I'll talk about the underlying question. And so the first thing to notice is, right, we have as a society disinvested in education over the last 40 years, right? And this is a consequence of having cut taxes, right? California with Proposition 13 is a central example of how when you cut taxes, you have to cut expenditures. And one of the most expensive things we did as a society in the 20th century was to fund an education system that was public, that was near universal, that was rigorous, and that produced the best educated workforce in the world, and hence a tremendous competitive advantage economically, but also because there was robust funding for local schools at the elementary level, at the middle school level, at the high school level, and at the college level. It also partially funded economic mobility, right? And so that diagram from Branko Milanovic that shows that there was less inheritance of privilege and wealth in the middle of the 20th century than there is today has largely to do with financing more universal education. Now, I'm going to push back a little bit on the idea that the problem is that individuals don't value education. I'll point out to you, there's a long history of reflection on this subject going back to Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill that says, yeah, of course kids don't like education. It's not very much fun. They'd rather be playing or doing whatever they want with their free time. But nevertheless, it's good for society, and ultimately it's good for the people who we may have to coerce to be educated, that they be educated. Being literate isn't just a pathway to economic mobility, it's also a pathway to autonomy, to self-assertion, to meaning creating, if you can access the world of ideas, both instrumentally, when you need to figure something out in order to advocate for yourself, but also to create narratives that help you understand your place in the world. You live a more autonomous, a more free, a more equal, and a more meaningful life. And so yes, we should force kids to be educated. I'll say one more thing here for a moment, and that is that it turns out, because you started off talking about vocabulary, and we have learned, right, through psychology, through education theory. I see David's got his hand up. I'm sure he wants to weigh in on this as well, given his background. But that so much of the capacity for language use, but also more generally for learning, is shaped in the first few years of life, and actually therefore in a period before most children are in school. At best they're in daycare, right? And so early childhood intervention and getting kids to good child care centers, but also, some of the best initiatives are just bringing people into people's homes to read to kids, to begin to expose them when they're young, when their capacity for language is really plastic and able to grow rapidly, so that you're not fighting an uphill battle in school, in middle school, trying to counteract what happened from years 1 to 3. I think that's really important, and another place that public policy should really be focusing. David, how'd I do?
Well, pretty well. Uh, Two or three things about the education issues. First of all, despite all of our attempts at compensatory education through Title I and things like that, the wealth in the funding of schools for rich and poor schools is still astonishingly wide. A friend of mine just did a survey in Michigan, and she compared the funding, the average per pupil expenditures in Ann Arbor with Detroit. It's $6,500 per pupil in Detroit, despite all the money going into Detroit. And it's $18,500 in Ann Arbor. And until and unless that gap is addressed, we have a problem. This related to that has to do with curriculum. The problem isn't so much the mean in education, it's the standard deviation and how unequally things are divided. And if you're a poor kid in a poor school, chances are that your curriculum and what you do in school will be determined by your scores on a low level basic skills assessment. If you're a rich kid in a rich school or a poor kid in a rich school, and it's school really more than anything else that determines it, the chances are that your curriculum, what you do day to day, will be determined by the imagination and creativity of your teacher, as well as assessments that assess more critical thinking and organization and things like that. So what we have is a curriculum in the United States where the rule of thumb is first you got to get the words right and the facts straight before you can do the what ifs and I wonder what's of the world. And you know what? If you're a low achiever in first grade, it's a good predictor of which track you will be on in high school. So you're right about early childhood education, but just because that's a critical place to invest our monies, it doesn't follow that we should therefore give up on trying to compensate things at the middle school and high school level. So it's a both and, not an either or. But we've got to get rid of this dual track curriculum where only the rich kids get access to the good stuff. And there's it's just heartbreaking to watch what happens over time, as we saw in the movie last night. to kids who get into a social and cultural setting where what's valued has nothing to do with the ostensible values of being a good citizen and living the good life in our society. It's a whole different set of cultural norms and a whole different set of models you look up to in terms of how it is you make money and get ahead and
So
the like. So,
two things come to mind quickly, and I just to very briefly reply. The first is the title of Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities, right? That the inequalities in our school system. I teach at a college that's located in Yonkers, but uses Bronxville as its PO, right? So it doesn't have to say Yonkers. I therefore look at the difference in funding between the Bronxville and the Yonkers school, 4-to-1 per pupil expenditure ratio. If you go to Bronxville, you're essentially going to a country club of a school. If you go to Yonkers, you're going to a typical American inner city school. And then we add to that, and again, I think this is really important to notice, that if you look at the prospects of the children who do least well on standardized tests, but come from the wealthiest 20%, with the prospects of the children who do the best on standardized tests, but come from the least well-off 20%. You compare those two groups, you know who has the better chance of getting into college? It's, sorry to be blunt and a little bit demeaning, the rich, stupid kids, as opposed to the poor, smart kids who actually have a better prospect for getting into college. And again, there's just something broken in our education system, in particular, in the idea of opportunity and merit. And yet those ideas continue to circulate as if our economy was only rewarding the merit of the people who are the most productive. So I'm going to come back to you, Hannah, but I think we're running out of time. So be brief if you can.
Yes, my question really was raised because the schools have a concentrated population, all of whom are in this situation of having limited vocabulary, of having ways of expressing themselves. It makes it very difficult, even if you put money in order to give the level of education that you would like.
Yeah, and there's a book by Jay McClade, which is very good on this, called Ain't No Making It. Again, it's a little bit older, but it studies the Boston Housing Project kids. And I think the other factor you have to weigh when you're looking at high concentrations of intergenerational poverty, it's not just that the schools are bad, that the schools are really, as Kozol points out, much more disciplinary institutions than they are educational institutions. It's also the peer socialization, right? And it starts with the parents. If the parents have experienced the schools as disciplinary institutions, not as places to go to learn and to create opportunity, and it's been a negative experience for them, they prepare their children. This is something you have to do, but don't let it injure your self-esteem. This doesn't really matter. And then their fellow classmates say to them in McCloyd's title, ain't no making it, right? Doesn't matter how well you do here, it's not going to translate into success in your life. And so there's not just the lack of educational preparation, there's the socialization that occurs in poor schools in the United States. So David, again, got to be brief. We're way over time. Go ahead.
Just one other point about vocabulary. Vocabulary isn't just about language. Vocabulary, words are the words are the things we use to name our knowledge. So a deficit in vocabulary is also a deficit in knowledge. And we live in a knowledge economy, and school success is determined largely by the acquisition of knowledge. So it's really a marker for something deeper and more vicious in terms of inequality.
And so I'm going to push back slightly, and don't get me wrong, I'm a liberal arts professor teaching mainly philosophy. I certainly want to have a rich and expressive vocabulary myself and on the part of everyone that I educate. But having said that, I just want to also notice that in our society, education and the way in which we use the cultural resources that education imparts, right? And so not just the vocabulary, but the ability to refer to certain kinds of art, certain kinds of literature, certain kinds of scientific and historical knowledge has become a critical way by which we mark our status, right? Then and marking that status has opened the doors for the people who have the capacity to mark their status accordingly, and close the doors for the people who might actually be very capable. Please note that when we say we live in a knowledge economy, so much of what we really mean is a technological economy. And frankly, you don't have to know your Shakespeare or your Manet to be a good programmer, right? And you know, that's really a different kind of intelligence. Yet we end up giving so many of those opportunities to the people who can talk the talk of the liberal arts these days. Final thing to notice, right, going back to Branko Milanovic and others, part of the reason there's so much homogamy, so much marriage within class as opposed to across class, is in part because we like being with people who seem like us, right? This is sometimes called, do I have it right? Homophilia, the loving the same, and that we have become much more culturally differentiated by education in the 21st century than we were in the middle of the 20th century. We watch different movies, we read different newspapers and books, we watch different kinds of sports, right? We didn't have worldwide wrestling in the middle of the 20th century. We were all watching baseball. And so the sense that we have come apart culturally and that's leading us to occupy very different social worlds is part of what's generating the level of inequality we have in the 21st century. All right, you guys have to eat lunch. I'm 3 hours ahead of you and I haven't eaten lunch yet. Enjoy your lunches. Great conversation today. Look forward to continuing it next week. Be well, everyone. Thank you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.